Main Street. And I am happy to be here today with all of you and moderating this Q&A with Mary Means, our fabulous keynote speaker from this morning. And I think, I don't know about you, Mary, but I think I would be okay with people, if they have questions, just unmuting and asking them. And or if you feel like you're having trouble getting in because somebody's ahead of you asking a question, I think you could also hit the raise hand function. If you scroll down to the bottom of the Zoom screen, you'll see a little reactions tab, and that provides you with the ability to raise your hand if you would like to. And Cam, I think you could probably stop showing. Yeah, thank you. And if nobody has any questions to start off, I actually had a few questions for you, Mary, that I wrote down. Okay. And maybe I'll start with the easiest one, which is, I was just curious as to how the 3 first Main Street, the pilot communities, were selected.
Well, that's a really good question. You might think that coming from a preservation organization, we would have looked for the most beautiful communities we could find. But we weren't looking for that. We were looking for places that had a range of issues. So we decided that we were looking not only for places that had some historic character, but also for places where people had been able to get something done. And it kind of, in a way, didn't matter what they'd gotten done. Like, were they able to raise the money to, put a new wing on the library or do anything really? So we had a long application form, and they had to send us pictures so we could see what it looked like and all that. And we got it down to 10 finalists. And then we literally visited. One of our staff went to every one of those to meet with people and to kind of ask that next level of question after, what have you managed to get done together? Or what do you think has held you back? And it was a real tough choice to come up with the 3. And in fact, there were several that made it into that group of 10 that essentially said, okay, we'll show you. And they kind of mirrored what we were doing and actually did a not bad job over a little longer period of time. But yeah, it was, of course, all of them were in the Midwest, because the National Trust was very territorial at the time, and got really upset if I wandered outside my 10-state region. So I tried to avoid that as much as possible.
How many had applied in the beginning?
70 in the Midwest, in these towns. And keep in mind, this isn't one where you could just post on Facebook, we're looking for a few good towns. There wasn't an internet. So basically it had to come through getting the word out through sort of state historic preservation offices, newspapers, wherever. But people did manage. I mean, 70 towns putting together a fairly significant application was pretty impressive in 1976.
Wow.
Yeah. I realized I wanted to ask me a question, which was, where can I get Mary's book? I think someone put that in the chat earlier. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I was going to suggest, if any of you have independent booksellers, a bookshop in your town, they can order it through their usual distributors. And I really like to see this book purchased through independent booksellers. I mean, if you only could get it through Amazon, it would be a travesty. It's about Main Street after all. So if you can work out with your local independent bookseller to do an event, I'd be glad to make an appearance at your event about it. And we'll try to make something of it. So that's an offer. And if COVID has lifted, I'd love to come to New Mexico. So.
Well, we would love to have you. And actually, Mary, maybe you could, if you wanted to kind of put that into an email and send that to Will or myself, I could reach out to you via Will. We could send information out about that, about kind of doing like a virtual book, whatever. We're going to be sending out information next week with the recordings of today, as well as some other information in preparation for day 2 next Friday. So I'd be happy to put that in there.
That's great.
Well.
Then Patrice and Matt sent something out from the Main Street Center a couple of weeks ago that had a little thing, hey, independent bookseller. But I'll send you that so you'll have
Okay.
everything for it.
Can I ask a
Perfect. That would be
question?
great.
Amy,
Go ahead.
what if it was a wonderful talk? Thank you, Ms. Leeds. That was great.
Thank
But
you.
what if at least like 5 or 6 or all of us wanted to bring her here to sign the book and be in our towns around the same time, so you could make one trip, not do all 28 towns or whatever, but you could do.
Oh, no, but a victory lap.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but for us it condenses the cost. Like we pay one airfare, and we just take care of you for that time, all of us together.
That's a great idea, and I would be wide open to it. And one of these days, travel's going to be possible.
Yeah, I think sooner rather than later, I hope.
Yeah.
Anyway, we would love it. It would be great. And it could be an event that we could do as our main streets in our towns and with our boards, which would be great.
That would be great fun. That would be great fun.
Yeah, well, it'd probably be great marketing for each of your programs too, to have one of the leaders of the Main Street movement there in your town.
You need an excuse to gather them together.
Well, and we have a
That's
a
right.
university. We could do it with Highlands University in our town, but other towns have universities too.
Yeah. Someone just
Absolutely.
asked if a comic book shop would count. I love comics. I think so. And maybe I should think about putting out a comic book version of this.
Absolutely. I think our executive directors are like superheroes. So I know Charles in town said he has a question. So go ahead, Charles.
Hi, Mary, and thank you for being with us. We a really fascinating talk and some of the topics you were discussing. I wanted to touch on a few of those. With the rise of the ability for people to work remotely, I think a lot of rural communities are starting to see a bit of an urban exodus, where I know in Taos, we're seeing a lot of people move into our little community from Texas, New York, California. And I'm wondering, if you could maybe speak a little bit to how smaller communities and maybe specifically Main Street programs could capitalize on those new people coming into our communities.
Well, I don't know. It seems to me that there's kind of always been, I'm glad to hear that some communities are getting this, and it doesn't surprise me that Taos is one of those. I think the ones that are getting hit with getting the first opportunity for this, depending on your viewpoint, with the first wave, are the towns that have kind of had a gentrifying experience in the last few years anyway. The ones that are near ski lifts, so that now none of the workers can afford housing there. So there are some issues along those lines, but I'm convinced that there's going to be another couple of waves of this that is not going to be aiming for the Taoses and the Steamboat. For one thing, the housing prices are going to skyrocket with it. But I hope what you were asking is sort of how do we integrate the come heres with the been heres, the natives and the new arrivals, because these are likely to be two dramatically different cultures. And I don't know, I think in a way a Main Street program might be in a good position to, in effect, offer some kind of program that's on, creating a cross-tribe, two-tribe culture melded into one, or a way to kind of ease into what life is like here in a place that's slower. The pace is slower probably than you've had. It's a place where people perhaps are friendlier, but you might position yourselves as welcoming the newcomers and helping introduce them to some of the folks that are there already. They may not have any idea how to get to know some of you, but maybe a mixer that is sort of, when we get back to where we're not all masked, maybe a mixer where it literally is to say, if you just moved here, we want to celebrate you and get to know you better at an event. And if anybody else has got great ideas with that, I'd love to hear them.
Well, a few people were saying they liked your use of the terms, the come heres and the been heres, and that's my first time to hear that too. So I like that term as well. It's kind of a good way to kind of think of it. And then Charles raises an excellent point too, as far as integrating people. And I think you're right that the Main Street program can be that entry point for people to engage in the community, particularly as, you know, the more people that we can engage and entice into our districts, the better. Farmington is saying that.
I'm guessing that one of the reasons that they've chosen some communities is because there is a Main Street program. I know that one entrepreneur who could have opened his tech incubator anywhere, literally, and I quote him in my book saying he knew that Cape Girardeau was going to be a good location because the presence of a Main Street organization meant that this community knew how to work together, and it wasn't going to be endless fighting and bickering. So I think in some ways, particularly if as the Main Street organization, you position yourselves as this is about the heart of our community, and you're now part of it. So we want to take you to our heart and welcome you in. It would be a nice gesture to make. I'd suggest having your most friendly people show up for it. If you've got people who can't stand come here, maybe they would go to another event, or maybe a second or third wave of this.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Because I've got more.
Yours might prompt some others from other people too.
Amy, I have one too.
Go ahead.
I was just really curious about, I mean, the 4-point approach is so such a strong part of what we do today. How did you land on those 4 elements for that 4-point approach?
Well, we started with about 100, and then we got it down to about 10. And then we really struggled with what to call the 4, because somewhere it was like, I think somebody in communications at the National Trust said, no one's ever going to be able to remember more than 5 things. So what are the 5 things? And we got it down to 4, just by saying, in effect, that the design bucket was not, historic preservation was not a bucket unto itself. And I think actually one of the breakthroughs that Main Street made for the preservation movement was that we were not about preservation per se. We were about giving these towns new life. So what it did was, instead of making preservation the end, it made it the means to the end as part of that. So you might have expected that historic preservation would be in like higher letters, but no, it's part of design. It's part of the visual dimension of downtown. And in each of those buckets, we were able to articulate the things that really kind of go in that category. And also to stress the importance of, don't choose one from column A and one from column B and ignore the other 2 at your peril. But it was I'll never forget, it was we did about a 2-day retreat, and we had some consultants that were working with us, urban design and landscape architecture and economics. And the consultants and the guys from the 3 towns and everybody went off to the place we could afford. And it was a Wisconsin summer camp in winter that had very little heat, if any. So we were bundled to the hilt, and we had all the walls filled with newsprint, and we're just kind of brainstorming what all are we learning, and then how can we reduce this to 1 wall instead of 4, and then on down. So that's kind of how they came up. But I want to point out that it's not just about 4 points. It's really about the concept of changing the whole image of the town. And that I want to really underline, it's more than just the physical image of it, although that's very important. It is about sort of changing the sense of whether we can do anything or not, whether we can accomplish it, whether it's worth trying. Because a lot of places, you know, this can get pretty beaten down, and many communities were before the pandemic hit, and that's just increased it. So I'll jump in with one more thing. It's probably more than you ever wanted to know from that answer. Someone said that the real secret to how Main Street works so well is that it's about a lot of little, lots of little. That these are generally small projects that are relatively affordable. It's not like you're saying we want to build a stadium in our town, so we have to find where there's stadium money that we can import in, or we have to have a developer from outside to do something big for us to get off the ground. The lots of little adds up. And it's not taking a lot of risk because in some cases it's only paint, but it does begin to make a sense that something's happened, and that can create its own momentum. And if something doesn't work, the kind of contemporary thing is fail fast. If something doesn't work, you can kind of ball it up and toss it aside and try something else, as opposed to that town in Vermont that lived with a totally vacant 2-block area for 30 years. That was not a lot of little. That was the exact opposite of it. Is we're going to bet the ranch, or we're going to bet the town on this idea.
We have had a lot of that in New Mexico as well. I have a few questions that have come through in the chat, Mary. One being, what do you see as the defining skills and competencies that make an effective Main Street manager?
I think number one would be, in an ideal world, it would be an understanding that what you've taken on is more than just a job. It's almost a calling, because you're going to be working on something that people care a great deal about. And sometimes they may have forgotten that they care a great deal about it, but you're going to be there in the middle of it, and you're going to be you're going to be very much in the limelight for it. I think having the skills of a really good listener, and I don't mean by just listening, like looking like you're listening, it's hearing, and maybe being able to say, you know, I'm hearing you. I think this is what you're trying to say, or this is what I'm getting. Am I right? Or did I get that right? And actually hearing what they're trying to give you, or trying to make clear there. So listening skills would be really big. I think another one would be an action orientation. I hate to see people just sort of follow the book. And I've been amazed listening to these hearings, some of the hearings about the insurgency in the Capitol, to hear how the intelligence people several days before, in effect, sent an email that said the house is on fire. And the email, they sort of picked up the phone, but they sent an email, and that email got forwarded, and it sounded like a complete let's check the box. It wasn't very action oriented at all. So I think what I'm looking for is the kind of personality that says, we need to move ahead with this. We need to show some results on it. So those would be very big skills. I think time management, otherwise you're going to go crazy. I listened in on a part of some of your earlier sessions about self-care. And I think all of us have the tendency to work until we drop. And while that is a real asset for a Main Street manager's position, it is certainly not a real asset for the Main Street manager person. So being able to kind of balance that would be a very good thing. The other I'd say is know when you're getting into it that you're not going to have any private moment. City managers have this same issue. And I remember going to my first conference of city managers and finding that there was a whole track for city managers' families, because they were kind of in a way paying a price for their that one of the parents was a city manager, and they were in the newspaper, and a lot of times they were being criticized or something, and it was just sort of like a healing opportunity for the spouses of city managers to come together. And I thought that was a really wonderful idea, because I would imagine that some of you are your spouse or significant other is a sounding board for some of this.
Well, I think also kind of along those same lines too, I remember our former state director, Rich Williams, saying that as Main Street executive directors, you're almost unelected elected officials, in that you're very much in front of people all the time. You're highly involved in all these different things that are happening, but you weren't actually elected into office, but you almost have to behave as one because you're trying to keep all these different stakeholders and constituents happy. in the work that you're doing.
That's a very good observation. Very good observation. And I would also say another characteristic, because you just reminded me, is the almost automatic instinct to give credit to others. Sort of, it isn't I, the Main Street person, am responsible for your town not falling apart. It's all these other people who have done the work and giving them full credit for it, sharing the spotlight.
Absolutely. We have another question, which is kind of on the same lines of one that I was going to pose to you. And this question is worded, what were some of your failures around talking with people to get them to understand the value of Main Street? So I think, maybe I might frame that as, what are some of the ways in which you do convince people to understand the value of Main Street? And then maybe what are some that you've seen not be as successful that people don't always buy into as much? The one thing I was going to mention in relation to that, which I have found a few times here, is, sometimes people don't care about historic preservation. They don't really care about the history of the downtown. So kind of on those same lines, how do we reach people to explain the value?
I'm going to surprise you with the first one. The first folks that I had to convince that this was worth doing was the National Trust for Historic Preservation, because it actually was unlike anything that preservation had been before we started doing this. And it wasn't aiming for perfection, and it wasn't aiming only to treat the most important, architecturally important buildings. It was aiming for something that was ultimately, as we all know, like underlying more important. And in fact, I tell folks who are congratulating me on having won the National Trust Crown and Shield Award last fall, it's the top award in historic preservation, that the thing that did for me more than anything else was it acknowledges that after 40 years, the National Trust for Historic Preservation accepts that Main Street is preservation. So that's part of it. So success works. But to get back to what might be a case for doing this with your local folks who might be skeptics, I think something that's helped a great deal is the place-based economic development, or the place-based, people like to be in environments that are the scale, the walkable scale, and the sort of in human scaled and inviting environments that have authenticity around them, that aren't just another set of chain stores with like a recently built Main Street like surrounding for it. They really like to be in places with authenticity. And that also authenticity, it doesn't have to be perfectly painted and perfectly tidy and all of that. In fact, a certain messiness kind of adds to it. And that 40 years of doing this has, and keeping those numbers, and some of you may hate having to collect those numbers, but it's a really important thing to do. There's no question that it is a fantastic return on investment. Probably far more so than the stuff that is out on highways and some of the, what I think Kennedy Smith calls them formula businesses, the kind of chain, the Applebee's and all of the world. A lot of the Main Street things, the Main Streets tend to stay together longer. Is that the experience some of you have had?
Oh, I think so. Well, I think even what you were mentioning about authenticity, and of course I can see Linda DiMarino right here in front of me, because she's one of the people popping up, and she's our director in Truth or Consequences. And I know her board president, saying they visited TRC, and I think, they just felt like they moved there from Washington, right, Linda? Like they
from Seattle.
said, like, yep. Mm-hmm. And I think also you've experienced, or I know there's a few different Main Street communities who've experienced people seeing that the investment is happening. And so then they say, okay, this is a place we want to come locate in. As you mentioned, people are working together. We can get that sense that they're doing something.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I gave a similar talk, this time with slides, in Iowa. And the director of economic development, secretary of economic development for the state, was part of the program with me. And I heard her remarks, which were just wonderful, because she loves Main Street. She's been doing this with the state for, I don't know, 25 years probably or so. But she loves the Main Street program and loves Main Street because they find it a really important asset for the rest of their sort of larger scale manufacturing and all, when they're trying to attract or help those larger industrial clients, that the main streets are a real asset because they make the place a lot more attractive for people to live. And these days, where a lot of people are fortunate enough to be able to choose the place rather than choose the job. I know that I did some work in downtown Wichita, Kansas, worked on the downtown plan there about 10 years ago. And that's one of the small, it's an aircraft center, Wichita. They make a lot of aircraft there, Beechcraft and all those were there. But the aircraft manufacturing firms were like 5-10 miles out from downtown because they need a lot of land. And we needed to get them on board because they were very powerful and influential CEOs. And the argument we were making for them was, you need to attract talent. You need to attract good aeronautical engineers, systems engineers, and all that. And these days, younger people like to live in a place where you can walk to coffee and where you can live downtown if you want to, and that are a lot funkier than just living in the suburbs. And Wichita doesn't have that. And that's what this downtown plan is all about, so that you will be able to, so it'll be a much more competitive place to attract the talent you're going to need for the next 20, 30 years. Well, they jumped on board, and it's amazing what has happened in 10 years in Wichita. Not because necessarily of them, but for one thing, we didn't have them, in fact, fighting against it. Why are you spending all that money downtown? Again, I rattle on.
I just wanted to say something real quick too, and I appreciate your perspective and what you said about National Historic Trust for Preservation in terms of how Main Street is preservation. And I know a lot of us, our local directors, myself, I mean, some of us that work for the state program, we're former local directors ourselves. And I don't think any of us came in, well, many of us didn't come into this work through thinking about preservation in terms of buildings or even the National Trust. But I think just the way that I always, when I approached it, it was more around community development, but they were great tools, right? Just to help us all get in and just really focus on the neighborhood, the people, more than just historic buildings, like you said. I mean, there's any number of building spaces, and I just appreciate that perspective, because I still see preservation more than buildings. It's the community, right? And and I appreciate the tools, and that's how I got into it and jumped full into it myself. And I know a lot of our folks did the same.
That's really wonderful. I think that's the really important part of understanding. We're going to be a majority brown nation in a few more years. That's partly what's going on right now in terms of the turmoil. But understanding the cultural differences between how some groups and some nationalities and different backgrounds have different ideas of aesthetics, and they have different ideas about what a viable shopping area looks like. What may look kind of messy and unkempt and all is something that looks very attractive and vital to folks that may not be from the Anglo culture. That the Main Street program was developed in an Anglo culture. So it has to be adapted, and you have to be conscious of that when you're working in a non-Anglo setting.
Absolutely, yeah. I know that Will had a question for you, so hopefully Will's still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. Hi, Mary. I had a question. Those of us who do this, we have our sort of toolbox, if you will, of things that we try to work on, particularly how I approach things. But you have a lot more experience than many of us, probably all of us. I was going to ask you, when working in districts, talking about low-hanging fruit or easy to enact, inexpensive interventions to help districts. Do you have some ideas that might be able to help some of us that, just thinking outside the box?
Well, clearly they're the ones that are just wear a coat of paint or a new sign on a willing and sort of early adopter can make a big difference, particularly if if a couple other people follow along. The first thing I'd advise is don't start with the ugliest building in town that just desperately needs a makeover or has been left abandoned for years and everyone's furious at the owner for letting it get that way. Start with others, because there's nothing quite like peer pressure when that ends up being the big eyesore that it will be after everything around it or a lot of the other stuff around it has been improved. That would be the first thing I would do, is just look for places where an inexpensive but very visible intervention or two can be there. The other thing I think that's really important is in how you communicate it, because each of these, if you envision the downtown, and I say this as a planner who did a lot of downtown and sort of community visioning, if you view the plan for revitalization, which I hope is very well articulated, if you view that as the lid to the jigsaw puzzle box, that's the picture, right? That's on the box cover. If you lose the lid, it's much harder to put the puzzle together, right? But if each of these lots of little efforts, the ones that are the early adopters and others, if they're not kind of identified somehow in your communications as, see this, it looks like it's just a piece of blue, but it's part of the sky up here. And if you can relate it back to, this is a progressive step towards what we're all trying to do here together. And George, thank you for finding the piece of blue for the sky right there. I'm not saying you should use my silly metaphors, but I think you get the picture, is to be able to communicate each of these smaller actions as steps along the progressive path towards where you're trying to go. That's really helpful. I think particularly because none of this stuff happens overnight. And people in 2 years might have forgotten what everything looked like 2 years ago, or what, they might have forgotten that this guy over here was doing something with Main Street, because by now it just looks like it's been there for a long time that way.
Thank you for that. I think a lot of our districts, they get a little intimidated because they may be new and they look at some of our older districts that have been doing this 20 years, 25 years, and they think we're never going to be like them, but they don't realize that at one point they were very similar. They just had a long time to do those little things that you talked about.
You actually ought to have an orientation, a visual orientation thing for some of the new arrivals to say, I want to show you what some of these towns look like and what they were like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And because I don't want you to think that when you drive into one today, that you are way behind because you're not looking like that, because that's what some of these places look like at the point where you're just getting started. So this is where you can go with it.
Absolutely. So technically we're a little bit over in our time, though I feel like we could keep going. Oh, I do see Patrick has a question. I see his hand is raised. Go ahead, Patrick.
You know what, not so much a question, but I just wanted to reiterate something. As a longtime member of a very well-run program that has accomplished so much of this, I want to reiterate some of the things that Mary has said since the beginning. It's the things that she said at the beginning and the middle and the end. And just every single one of these things, I'm sitting here with goosebumps and teary-eyed, because just everything you have said, I look back and go, yes, that's been an absolute key part of what has made us GAMSA, and what and to all of the younger programs, you have to. We started in 1985 and all of downtown Silver City was boarded up windows, and you can do it. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. You know,
Thank you, Patrick.
I think the smartest thing that we might have done back in the early 70s was to say, we're going to go in and work in real towns. And we're going to admit that we don't know anything about what we're doing. so that the town, as part of its being selected, knew that we were in this together. We were going to try to figure it out together. And we were going to try to extract from it what we were learning, so that it's a very practical approach that's been not only tested over 40 years now, but it was actually tested before we even tried, driving it down the street or walking it down the street. Because I believe that we have to make things like this accessible to average people. It can't be something that only professionals can understand. And people who think they may not be able to do it need to see some examples of folks just like them who actually have been able to do it. So I'm delighted, Patrick, to hear that all this resonated so much. That's very fulfilling.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're a little bit over in time. Any final thoughts or closing remarks you want to make, Mary?
No, other than I have the greatest admiration for all of you, because if you have lived to show up today, whether by your name on the screen or your picture on the screen or your actual face, it means you've lived through probably the most difficult year any of us are going to have to experience. I hope it's the most difficult one we'll ever experience. And you're still there, and you're still caring, and you're helping with the rebuilding on it. And to me, that makes you the heroes and heroines of the country. And please don't lose track of the idea that you are part of this web, this interdependent web of regeneration that the country is going to have to go through. And you're not by yourselves. You can lean on each other, and you can lean on the state, and you can lean on the national one. And I'm going to be watching your progress. So thank you all for some wonderful questions and wonderful comments in the chat. I really appreciate it. And now, goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Mary. I'll have Will connect us so we can get that information from you and get that out to the network.
That's terrific. Have a wonderful next day or so of the conference. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.